When a girl is treated as merchandise, something inside her dies long before her innocence is stolen. Hello, my dear friends. This is Grandma Teresa here with my 68 years of life experience and a story that's been locked in my soul for over 5 decades. I'm sitting here on my porch in Bakersfield, California, enjoying my coffee and butter cookies while the cicadas sing in the maple tree in my backyard. Today, I've decided to open my heart to you all because certain truths need to be told, even if they hurt the soul of both the teller and the listener. Before I begin this difficult journey, I'd like to ask you who are watching now to please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. It'll mean a lot to know I'm not alone in sharing this story. And if you can comment below which city you're watching from, okay, your kindness gives me strength to continue. Also, folks, I'd love to know how many pregnancies you've had. I would love to read about that in the comments of this video. Let's go back to 1955 when I didn't even exist yet. My mother, Irene, was 18 years old and in love with a young man named Anthony who worked in construction in Sacramento. They had plans to get married when they discovered I was on the way. My father was very happy with the news from what my mother told me. He started working overtime, saving every penny to prepare our simple little house in the outskirts of the city. It was at one of these construction sites, working on the 3rd floor of a building under construction, that tragedy struck. A scaffold gave way and my father fell. Traumatic brain injury, they said. He didn't even make it to the hospital alive. My mother was 5 months pregnant when she received the news. I never knew my father, but to this day, I carry the only photo of him that my mother kept in a small wooden box. A thin young man with a shy smile and kind eyes. His death changed everything. My mother, without education and pregnant, couldn't find work. My father's family was from rural Kentucky and barely had enough to support themselves, so they couldn't help. That's when my maternal grandfather, Mr. Gerald, offered us shelter. At the time, it seemed like a blessing, but today I know it was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years. I was born in January 1956, at home with a midwife, a beautiful girl with green eyes like her father. My mother would say life was difficult, but in those first years there was some semblance of normality. We lived in the back of my grandfather's house in a small room that he had adapted. My mother took in laundry, cleaned houses around town, sold candy at the school gate. It barely gave us enough to eat properly, but we managed. My grandfather, Gerald, had been in the military in his youth. He was a hard man of few words and many rules. A widower hour for years he managed his small pension with an iron fist. He wasn't affectionate, but he wasn't cruel in my early years either. He was just absent, as if I were a necessary inconvenience that he tolerated out of love for his daughter. Things began to change when I turned 7. I remember my grandfather watching more closely when I played in the yard. "This girl is growing too pretty for our own good," he commented once to my mother. At the time, I didn't understand what that meant. Today, with the wisdom of years, I know he was already calculating my market value. I went to school like all children, but I was always quiet, observant. The teacher said I was intelligent, but too shy. The truth is that there was something about male figures that already caused an instinctive fear in me. Maybe it was the way my grandfather looked at me. Or maybe it was just the absence of my father, a figure I only knew through stories. Our financial situation was increasingly difficult. My mother was aging before her time. Her hands cracked from washing powder, her back bent from scrubbing floors. Some nights I would hear her crying quietly in our little room. I pretended to be asleep, but kept each sob in my heart. At 10 years old, I started helping my mother with chores. I washed smaller clothes, swept the yard, sold cookies she made to neighboring houses. It was during this time that I noticed how my grandfather looked at teenage girls passing by on the street. A look that gave me chills, even without fully understanding why. "Women are like fruit, Teresa," he told me once when he caught me watching him. "You have to pick them at just the right time. Not too green, not too ripe." I was confused by that strange comparison, but kept it to myself like I kept so many other things. My mother worked more and more and stayed less and less at home. I noticed that she avoided spending too much time near her own father, as if something about him frightened her too. Years later, I understood that she probably intuited what was to come, but was too trapped by necessity to do anything about it. When I turned 12, we had a serious problem. My mother fell ill, a severe pneumonia that left her bedridden for almost 2 months. Unable to work, debts piled up. My grandfather's pension money barely covered the medicines. It was during this time that I saw him talking to an unknown man at our gate. A fat man about 40 years old, well-dressed with a big car parked out front. They looked at me a few times during the conversation, and the man smiled in a way that made me run inside the house. "Who was that man, Grandpa?" I asked after the stranger left. "A friend who can solve our problems, Teresa. He's interested in getting to know you better." That phrase echoed in my head for days. I was still too innocent to fully understand. But something deep inside me was sounding alarms. My mother gradually got better, but the financial situation only worsened. The landlord threatened eviction. The Armacies didn't want to sell on credit anymore. That's when on a May night, a few months before my 13th birthday, I overheard a conversation that would change my life forever. "She's still too young, Dad." My mother's voice sounded anguished. "Not young at all. She's almost a woman. And Dr. Augustus offered a lot of money." "Money we need, Irene. Or have you forgotten the bills you have to pay? But she's just a child. My daughter. And what good is being your daughter if you both end up on the street? The doctor won't hurt her. He just wants her to carry a child that his wife can't have. She's strong, healthy, beautiful. It's a service like any other." I felt my blood freeze in my veins. Even without fully understanding what they were planning, I realized that something terrible was being decided about me, without my knowledge or consent. "And after the child is born?" my mother asked, her voice already weaker, as if beginning to yield. "They take the baby, we keep the money, and life goes on. If it works out, there are other interested couples. We can solve our situation once and for all." I will never forget the silence that followed. A long, heavy silence that seemed to contain all the weight of the terrible choices adults make when they're desperate. "All right," I finally heard my mother say, her voice choked with held-back tears. "But I don't want to know the details, and I don't want to be here when it happens." I ran back to my bed, my heart beating so hard I thought it might jump out of my mouth. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay looking at the wooden ceiling of our little room, trying to understand what was coming, praying that I had misunderstood. But I hadn't misunderstood. 3 days later, my mother announced she would be spending the weekend at a friend's house. It was the first time she had left me alone with my grandfather, and her eyes couldn't meet mine when she said goodbye. "Be a good girl, Teresa," was all she said before leaving, carrying a small bag and leaving her dignity behind. That same night, my grandfather came into my room and threw a dress on my bed, a light blue dress, simple but the prettiest I had ever seen in my life. "Put this on," he ordered, "and wash your hair properly. Dr. Augustus is coming to dinner tonight." That's when I understood there was no escape, that the fate they had planned for me was sealed, that my body, still developing, had been sold without me having any choice in the matter. I washed my long hair as best I could, put on the dress that was a little loose in the chest, and waited, sitting on the edge of the bed, my heart pounding with fear. When the doorbell rang, I felt like vomiting. Dr. Augustus arrived at 7 in the evening, bringing a bottle of wine for my grandfather and a box of chocolates for me. During dinner, which my grandfather had ordered from the restaurant on the corner, something we never did for lack of money, the man observed me with an interest that made me want to disappear. "She's perfect, Mr. Gerald," he said as he analysed me across the table. "Is she in good health? Never had any serious illness? Healthy as a horse?" My grandfather replied as if he were selling a farm animal. "Strong, smart. She'll give good offspring, doctor, you can bet on it." I kept my eyes down, tears threatening to fall at any moment. The man extended his hand and touched my face, lifting my chin to look me in the eyes. "You don't need to be afraid, girl. I'll take good care of you. And when our child is born, you will have received enough to help your mother for a long time." I couldn't answer. His hand on my face seemed to burn my skin, and the smell of expensive cologne mixed with cigarettes made me nauseous. After dinner, my grandfather suddenly said he needed to go to the store to buy cigarettes. He never smoked in his life. It was the agreed signal. As soon as the door shut, Dr. Augustus approached me on the sofa. "Your grandfather explained everything to me," he said, his heavy hand landing on my knee. "You'll carry my child since my wife can't. It's an honor, you know. We're paying very well for it." I tried to move away, but he held my arm firmly. "It won't hurt much," he continued, his voice now lower, more threatening. "And you'd better cooperate because your grandfather has already received half the money in advance. If you don't do your part, he'll have serious problems." It was at that moment, looking into the eyes of that man who planned to use my body as if it were merchandise, that something inside me began to die. The dreamy girl who still believed in fairy tales, the child who hoped that one day things would get better, the daughter who still trusted that her mother would protect her from all harm. What happened that night was the first of many horrors I would experience in the years to come. When my grandfather returned hours later, I was huddled in the corner of the room with the blue dress torn and stained, crying silently. He just looked at me, turned on the lamp, and said the words that would haunt me for decades. "Get used to it, girl. From now on, this is your function in the family." And so my nightmare began. A nightmare that would last for years and give me 10 children that I was never able to raise. 10 pieces of my heart ripped out and given to strangers. 10 living memories of the horrors I experienced. That first night with Dr. Augustus was just the beginning of a path of darkness that I, a girl of almost 13, would be forced to walk. The next morning, I woke up with a sore body and a shattered soul. But there was no time to grieve. My grandfather came into the room early, threw a clean dress on the bed, and ordered me to get up. "Drink this tea," he said, extending a steaming mug. "It's good for a woman after. Well, it will help ensure the seed takes." Those words, so crude and inhumane, made me understand that, in his view, I was no longer his granddaughter. I was just a fertile field to be cultivated for profit. The tea tasted bitter, of herbs that I later discovered were used by midwives in rural areas to strengthen the uterus. I drank in silence, the dried tears on my face forming trails of salt. My mother returned 2 days later. Her eyes were swollen from crying so much, but she couldn't face me. She walked right past me, locked herself in our little room, and only came out hours later. When we finally met in the kitchen, I tried to say something to express my pain, my feeling of betrayal. She just raised her hand, stopping my words. "Don't say anything, Teresa. What's done is done." It was the first time I felt anger toward her, a deep, visceral anger that mixed with the love and dependence I still felt. How could a mother allow this? How could she pretend nothing had happened? But then, that same afternoon, I saw something that confused my feelings even more. My mother paying at the grocery store, paying overdue bills, buying real food for our always empty pantry. The price of my innocence was feeding our family. And this was just the beginning. In the following weeks, I lived in a constant state of alert. Every noise at the gate made me tremble. Every look from my grandfather seemed to announce a new visit, a new horror. School became my only refuge. There, for a few hours, I could pretend to be just a normal girl with dreams and hopes like any other. Teacher Mrs. Cynthia noticed my change. "Teresa, you're different." "Did something happen at home?" she asked. One afternoon, holding me after class. I opened my mouth to tell everything, to beg for help. But my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. "If you tell anyone, they'll take you to the orphanage. And there, girl, it's much worse than here." "I'm just tired, teacher," I replied, lowering my eyes. "I've been helping a lot at home." A month after the first visit, Dr. Augustus returned, and after him, others came. Not many at first. My grandfather was careful, didn't want to raise suspicions in the neighborhood. One man here, another there, all older, all with wives who couldn't have children, all willing to pay well for the use of my young body to produce their heirs. When my period was late, 2 months after that first night, my grandfather celebrated as if he had won the lottery. "It worked on the first try," he exclaimed to my mother, who just nodded in silence. I remember placing my hand on my still flat belly, trying to feel some connection with the life that was beginning to form there. A life created in violence, but not guilty of anything. Dr. Augustus was informed and appeared the next day with his wife, a thin and elegant woman named Claire. She looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and contempt that I will never forget. "You're going to give us the greatest gift of all," she said, forcing a smile while her husband talked to my grandfather on the porch. "But remember, it's not your child, it's ours. You're just the gardener who takes care of our seed." During that first pregnancy at 13, my body changed rapidly. I had to stop going to school when my belly started to show. "We'll say you went to spend some time with relatives in the country," my grandfather explained. "When you come back without a belly, nobody will ask much." I was confined to the house for months. Dr. Augustus paid for vitamins, good food, even maternity clothes. I was treated like a prize hen that needed to be well fed to produce the best egg. Every 2 weeks, he and his wife would appear to monitor the development. He would examine me, measure my belly, listen to the baby's heart. Those moments were too humiliating to describe. My mother during this period began to change. With money coming in, she reduced her cleaning jobs. She bought new clothes, started going out more with friends. It was as if she was trying to escape the reality of what was happening in our house, as if she wanted to believe the money came from another source. "You're going to give a better life to our family," she would sometimes say in a rare moment when we were alone. "One day you'll understand that we did what was necessary, but I didn't understand, and I never would." The birth of my first child, a boy, happened at home with a midwife paid by Dr. Augustus. It was painful, frightening, an experience that no 13-year-old girl should go through. When I finally heard the strong cry of that child I had carried for 9 months, something awakened inside me. An instinct, a love so deep and immediate that it left me breathless. "I want to see my son," I asked, extending my arms to the midwife who was already wrapping him in a blue blanket. "He's not your son," she replied dryly, handing the baby to Claire, who was waiting anxiously at the door. "You've done your part. Now rest." I heard my son's crying diminishing as they took him away. Tears ran down my face as I stared at the ceiling, helpless. It was the first time a part of my heart was torn from me. It wouldn't be the last. I received his name days later. Peter Augustus. The doctor made a point of telling me, perhaps as a distorted form of gratitude, he also brought me a fat envelope with money. "Your part for the excellent work," he said. The money went straight into my grandfather's hands. Of course, I had only 2 weeks to recover before my grandfather came with the news. There was another couple interested, a coffee farmer from Northern California and his young wife who couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. "But I just had a baby," I protested, my body still sore, my breasts still leaking milk that no baby would suckle. "I need time." "Time is money, girl," he replied, relentless. "And this farmer is paying double what Dr. Augustus paid. That's how at 14 I became pregnant for the second time. And then for the third, almost without interval, my young, strong and healthy body, as my grandfather liked to point out to clients, recovered quickly. I was an efficient producer in his distorted view. Between my 13th and 18th years, I gave birth to 5 children, 5 babies who were torn from my arms before I could even memorize their faces. To the outside world, I was Mr. Gerald's problematic granddaughter, who was always coming and going from relatives in the country, always sick, always reclusive. In reality, I was a prisoner, a reproductive slave kept under control by my own family. My mother during this period transformed into someone I barely recognized. With the money from my services, she bought her own house on the other side of town. She would come to visit us once in a while, always well-dressed, always in a hurry. She got what she wanted, financial freedom. The price was her own daughter's freedom. "Why do you allow this?" I asked her once, my belly large with what would be my 4th child. "Why don't you help me escape?" She looked away, unable to face my direct accusation. "Escape to where, Teresa? With what money? To do what? You didn't even finish elementary school. And now you have this reputation." "What reputation?" "The one you created for me of a girl who disappears and appears pregnant. People talk daughter and your grandfather. He has connections. There are important people involved in this. People who wouldn't like to be exposed." That's when I understood I wasn't just a victim of my grandfather. I was a victim of an entire system that allowed powerful men to buy a girl's body. That turned a blind eye to the obvious. That blamed the victim instead of the aggressor. I realized that even if I escaped, where would I go? Who would believe my story? At 19, I had already given birth to 6 children. My body showed the marks of so many consecutive pregnancies. Silver stretch marks covered my belly and breasts. My uterus was weakened, as one of the midwives warned me. "This girl needs rest, Mr. Gerald, or she won't be able to have any more." This warning scared my grandfather enough to give me an interval of almost a year, the longest period of rest I had in all my youth. During this time, I tried to gather strength, think of alternatives, but I was constantly watched. Had no money of my own, no documents, no formal education. It was during this period that I met Jeanette, a woman who sold medicinal herbs and sometimes helped with births. She would come to care for me after the births, prepare teas for recovery, apply compresses. Gradually, I gained her trust. "What they're doing to you isn't right, girl," she whispered one day while applying an ointment to my stretch marks. "It's against God's law and man's law." For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. Someone saw the truth. Someone recognized the horror of my situation. "Help me escape, Mrs. Jeanette," I begged, holding her wrinkled hands. "Please." She shook her head sadly. "I can't, child. Your grandfather has the sheriff in his pocket. I've seen others try to escape and end up in worse situations, but I can teach you to protect yourself a little." It was Jeanette who taught me about herbs that could temporarily reduce my fertility, giving me short periods of relief between forced pregnancies. It wasn't freedom, but it was something. minimal control over my own body. When I turned 20, I was already a mother to 7 children I never got to raise. 7 pieces of my heart scattered among rich families in California and neighboring states. My body was tired, my soul shattered. But something inside me refused to give up completely. I began to keep small bits of information about each client, each baby, names, dates, peculiarities. I hid this data under a loose floorboard in my room. I didn't know yet how I would use this information, but something told me that one day it would be important. 3 pregnancies later, approaching my 23rd year, my body began to show signs of exhaustion. The birth of my 10th child was particularly difficult. I lost a lot of blood, had an infection, almost died. The doctor who was hurriedly called and well paid to keep the secret was emphatic. This young woman cannot have any more children. The uterus is extremely compromised. To my grandfather, it was as if his golden goose had broken for me. Ironically, that medical complication represented a distorted form of freedom. Without being able to produce more children, what use would I be? What would they do with me now? The answer came faster and was crueler than I imagined. And with it, finally came my determination to end that cycle of horror once and for all. You must be wondering how a person survived so much horror while maintaining sanity. The truth is that part of me died with each baby that was taken from my arms. I created a kind of internal fortress, a place within my soul where I kept fragments of the girl I once was and the children I never got to cradle. The years between my first child and the 10th passed like an endless nightmare. After the 3rd baby, I realized I needed to find a way to endure that life to avoid going completely insane. I began to disconnect from the world around me, to live as if I were observing everything from a distance. People who know this kind of trauma call it dissociation. I called it survival. The 4th baby was born when I was 16, a girl with light hair like mine. Only in that instant, when the midwife lifted her, could I see her perfect little face before they took her away. I cried for weeks. That's when I started writing on scraps of paper that I hid under the mattress, names, dates, details of each child. I couldn't have photos, so I drew as best I could. Small faces, little hands, the shape of the eyes. It was my way of keeping them alive inside me. My routine between 16 and 23 years was predictable in its horror. Periods of active service, as my grandfather called the times, when I was visited by men who wanted to impregnate me, then months of pregnancy where I was well fed and kept under constant surveillance to ensure healthy babies. The birth, always painful, always followed by brutal separation. Then a brief period of recovery and everything would start again. The 5th child was born when I was 17, another boy. The 6th shortly after I turned 18. The 7th at 19, 8th and 9th with small intervals reaching my 22nd year. And finally, the 10th when I was 23, the birth that almost killed me and permanently damaged my uterus. Between these pregnancies, I experienced moments of despair so deep that I considered taking my own life. What stopped me were those hidden scraps of paper, the records of my children. If I left, who would keep their memory? Who would know the truth about their origins? Meanwhile, my mother prospered with the money that my suffering generated. She bought a better house, then a small business, a clothing store downtown. She took trips to New York to buy merchandise, had new friends, frequented the best salon in town. Our relationship became an insurmountable abyss. On the rare occasions she came to visit, she brought expensive and useless gifts, pretty dresses I could only wear between pregnancies, perfumes, trinkets, as if objects could compensate for selling her own daughter. If you're enjoying my life story, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. This simple act helps me tremendously. One day you'll understand that I did the best I could with what we had, she would say, repeating this phrase like a mantra that perhaps helped her sleep at night. I never answered. What could I say that I understood? That would be too big a lie, even by our family's distorted standards. My grandfather, on the other hand, displayed his prosperity more discreetly. He renovated the house, bought a new radio, drank imported beer. More importantly, he gained status. He was seen as a successful businessman, invited to important town events, treated with respect. Nobody questioned the source of his sudden income. Nobody asked about the granddaughter who appeared and disappeared. Always reclusive, always sick. The men who paid for the use of my body varied, but they had things in common. All were rich. All had positions of power. Doctors, farmers, politicians, businessmen. All had wives who, for some reason, couldn't have children, and all saw themselves as benefactors, as if they were doing me a favor by repeatedly raping me. You should be grateful, one of them, an important politician from the region, told me once as he buttoned his pants after another session of torture disguised as a conception attempt. Many girls would give anything to have what you have. Good food, clothes, a roof, and all you have to do is lie down and receive the seed. I swallowed my response along with my dignity. I learned early that protesting only made things worse, that screaming only brought more pain, that crying only irritated them. So I became silent, absent even when present, a body without a soul that they used as they pleased. There were exceptions, of course. Not all were cruel. Some seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the arrangement, but too desirous of a child to question the morality of what they were doing. One of them, a university professor from Sacramento, even asked me if I was there of my own free will. Before I could answer, my grandfather intervened. Of course she is, Doctor. She knows the importance of the work she does, generating lives for families who can't have children naturally. The lie was so absurd I almost laughed. Almost. But laughter, like so many other emotions, had died in me a long time ago. The wives of these men treated me in different ways. Some with reluctant gratitude, others with thinly disguised jealousy, most with a mixture of contempt and fascination. I was both the solution to their problems and the living reminder of their failures. The only thing they had in common was the determination to take for themselves the babies my body produced, as if they were merchandise ordered from a store. Don't get attached. The wife of the seventh client warned me when she noticed I was caressing my belly while humming a lullaby. It will be easier for everyone if you remember your place in this arrangement. My place. As if I had chosen that position, as if I had had any choice at all. The eighth birth was particularly traumatic. The child was in breech position, and the traditional midwife couldn't resolve the situation. After hours of agony, they had to call a doctor, not the child's father, but another doctor, generously paid to ask no questions. He performed painful maneuvers, and finally, the baby was born. A girl so small and fragile that I thought she wouldn't survive. Don't even think about dying, I whispered to her when they briefly placed her in my arms before taking her away. Be strong like your mother had to be. At that moment, something changed in me. A resolution began to form, still nebulous, still without defined form. If I couldn't save my children, if I couldn't get them back, perhaps I could at least ensure they knew the truth one day, that they weren't the children of the women who raised them, but of a young woman who never had a choice. I began to be more methodical in my secret notes, not just names and dates, but addresses I occasionally managed to hear in conversations, details about the parents, birth arcs, or distinctive features of each baby. anything that might one day help identify them. Between the 9th and 10th births, I had the longest period of rest, almost 10 months. My body was showing clear signs of exhaustion. I was only 22, but looked much older, weakened by consecutive pregnancies, difficult births, traumatic separations, and constant abuse. Some days I could barely get out of bed. It was during this period that I discovered my mother had bought a beach house in Santa Barbara, a vacation retreat built with the money generated by my suffering. The news came through Jeanette, who continued to be my only connection to the outside world. "Your mother showed up there with a new car," she told me while changing the herbal compresses she applied to my aching back. Talking about the new house on the beach, inviting people to visit. "Seems business is going very well." That was like a punch to the stomach. While I lived an endless nightmare, my own mother enjoyed the fruits of my torment with no apparent remorse. The betrayal was almost as painful as the physical abuse. When I became pregnant for the 10th time at 23, something in me already knew it would be the last. My body was at its limit. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Constant nausea, bleeding, pains that wouldn't cease. The doctor who occasionally came to examine me, lavishly paid by the father of the child, a businessman from the coffee sector, showed concern, but no one dared suggest terminating the pregnancy. The final product, the baby, was too valuable to be lost. Labor began prematurely in the 8th month. Excruciating pain, hemorrhage, high fever. I vaguely remember being rushed to a private clinic on the outskirts of town where no one would ask questions. I remember the doctor's frightened face, the nurses running, my grandfather pale with worry. Not for me, of course, but for the money he would stop receiving if I died. The baby was born, a small but healthy boy who was immediately taken away. I, on the other hand, was between life and death for days. Generalized infection, severe hemorrhage, irreparably damaged uterus. When I finally regained consciousness completely, the doctor was clear. "You cannot have any more children. It was necessary to remove part of your uterus to save your life." For most women, that news would be devastating. For me, it was like a door opening after a decade locked in a dungeon. Not being able to have more children meant I would no longer serve the purpose my grandfather had intended for me. It meant that maybe finally I could glimpse some form of freedom. But reality proved to be quite different from my brief hope. When I returned home after 2 weeks in the hospital, I found my grandfather sitting in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a calculating look. I knew all too well. "You cost me a fortune with all this trouble," he said without even asking how I was. "And now you're no good for the main purpose." I kept silent, waiting. I knew that anything I said could worsen what was to come. "But you're still young and pretty," he continued, studying me as if evaluating an animal. "You can still serve for other types of service. I have friends who would pay well for an experienced young woman like you, even if you can't give children." The horror of that suggestion hit me like lightning. After everything I had been through, after having my body used as an incubator for a decade, now I would be transformed into a pure and simple sexual object. The idea was unbearable, even worse than what I had already lived through. It was at that moment, facing my grandfather and seeing in him no longer the man who should protect me, but the monster who had destroyed my life, that I made my final decision. It was time to end that cycle of horror, no matter the cost. It was time to seek my freedom or die trying. With a calmness that surprised even myself, I just nodded slightly and retired to my room. I said nothing, showed no revolt. I let him think he had broken me completely, that I was just an empty shell, ready to accept any fate he planned for me. But that night, alone in my room, I swore by the 10 children who were stolen from me that that man would pay for every tear I shed, for every scream I suppressed, for every piece of me that was sold without my consent. I swore I would find a way to escape and to ensure he never did to another girl what he had done to me. Revenge, they say, is a dish best served cold, and I, after 10 years in hell, was ready to serve mine. I planned my revenge with the patience of someone who has waited too long, with the cold calm of someone who has nothing more to lose. While my body slowly recovered from the surgery that saved my life, but took away my ability to have more children, my mind worked tirelessly, elaborating every detail of what I would do next. My grandfather gave me 2 weeks of rest before starting to bring visitors to meet me. Different men from before. They weren't looking for children. They were just seeking pleasure without commitment. Old friends of his, local politicians, businessmen on business trips, all willing to pay well for a few hours with a young woman who, according to him, already knew how to please a man. I pretended submission. I lowered my eyes, nodded when he gave orders, didn't protest. I wanted him to believe he had completely broken me, that I was just a doll without a will of my own. It was crucial that he didn't suspect the fire growing inside me. During the day when I was alone in the house, my grandfather maintained his usual routines, leaving in the morning for his business. I began to search every corner of that house. I needed 3 essential things: money, documents, and evidence. The money was the easiest to find. My grandfather, despite his natural distrust, had become too confident over the years. He kept a good amount at home, hidden in a false bottom inside the old wardrobe. Not much, but enough to give me a start somewhere else. The documents were more complicated. My grandfather kept everything locked in a desk drawer. The key, I discovered after days of observing his movements, stayed on a keychain he always carried with him, except when he took a shower. It was during one of these showers that I managed to make a soap copy, which I later used to mold an improvised key. When I finally opened that drawer, I found my whole life summarized in yellowed papers. Birth certificate, old school documents, even a vaccination card from my childhood. But most importantly, I found the records of my grandfather's business. Notebooks where he meticulously noted each transaction, each payment received for the sale of my body, and the babies I generated, names, dates, values, the complete evidence of his crimes. I took those notebooks with trembling hands, hardly believing he would be stupid enough to keep such compromising records. But I understood it was his trophy, his proof of cleverness. He never imagined I would dare to touch his things, that I would have the courage to face him. I photographed each page using a simple camera I bought from a neighbor, saying I wanted to record the flowers in the yard for a personal project. Then I returned the notebooks exactly as they were. He couldn't suspect anything until it was too late. The third element of my plan was the most difficult. I needed an ally, someone who could help me escape when the time came. Someone I could trust in a world where trust had been stolen from me along with everything else. That's when I thought of Jeanette, the old healer who had helped me for years, who had taken care of me after each birth, who looked at me with genuine compassion when everyone else just saw a commodity. If there was someone who would help me, it would be her. One afternoon when my grandfather went out to handle business in the capital, I sent a neighborhood boy to call her saying I was feeling ill. When she arrived, anxious and breathless, I closed the door behind her and finally poured out everything. Not just what everyone already knew about the forced pregnancies, but my escape plan, my need for justice. "Girl," she said after listening to me in silence, "what you're planning is dangerous. Your grandfather has powerful friends. If it goes wrong, I'll be dead." I completed with a calmness that frightened her. But I've been dead inside for years, Mrs. Jeanette. What do I have to lose? She studied me for a long time, her old eyes weighing not just my words, but the determination behind them. Finally, she nodded. I'll help you, child, but we have to be very careful. It was Jeanette who made contact with a journalist from a Sacramento newspaper. She didn't tell the whole story, just enough to spark interest. A young woman kept in captivity, forced to bear children for sale, a scheme of years involving powerful people. The kind of story that could make an ambitious reporter's career. Meanwhile, I continued my farce of submission. I received the clients my grandfather brought, pretended to be resigned to my fate. He was so confident in the control he exercised over me that he began to get careless. He no longer locked my bedroom door at night. Sometimes he would go out and take a long time to return, leaving me alone for hours. I took advantage of these moments to organize everything I would need. Basic clothes in a small bag, hidden under the bed, the money I had been diverting little by little, rolled up in old socks, the important documents which I managed to recover from the desk, and most importantly, all the evidence of my grandfather's crimes carefully documented. The plan was simple but risky. On a night when my grandfather would be out for an important meeting at the Commercial Association, Jeanette would come to get me. We would go straight to Sacramento where the journalist would meet us. I would deliver all the evidence, give my complete testimony, and then disappear. I would start a new life far from there with a new identity that Jeanette had provided through contacts I preferred not to question. Everything was ready, every detail planned. I waited with growing anxiety for the appointed day, June 15th, 1979, a date I would never forget. But as they say, even the best-laid plans can go wrong, and mine almost fell apart on the eve of the escape. My grandfather came home earlier that day, visibly altered by drink. This was already unusual. He rarely drank to excess, priding himself on always keeping his mind alert for business. Something had happened. Something serious. "Get ready," he ordered, throwing a travel suitcase on my bed. "We're leaving town early tomorrow." I felt my blood freeze in my veins. Leaving where to? Kentucky. A friend of mine has an isolated farm there. We'll stay for a while until things cool down around here. "What things?" I asked, trying to control the tremor in my voice. He gave me a suspicious look as if assessing whether I knew something. "My business. Just do as I told you." When he left the room, I allowed myself a moment of silent panic. Everything was falling apart. Somehow he had discovered something, maybe about the journalist, maybe about my plans. It didn't matter. What mattered was that, if I left that house with him the next morning, I would never have another chance. I would have to act that very night alone, without Jeanette, without the support I had planned. It was now or never. I waited until I heard loud snores coming from his room. The drink at least had served a purpose. He was sleeping deeply. With my heart beating so hard I thought he might hear it, I gathered my already prepared belongings and quietly approached the door. That's when I heard light knocks on the back window. Petrified with fear, I waited. The knocks repeated in a specific pattern that I immediately recognized. It was the signal arranged with Jeanette. I carefully opened the window to avoid making noise. There she was, her wrinkled face tense with worry. "We need to go now," she whispered. "Your grandfather discovered something. He's planning to take you away tomorrow." "How do you know?" I asked, surprised. "Clarice's son works at the bar where your grandfather was today. He heard everything. He received a warning from someone in the police, a friend. It seems the journalist asked too many questions, drew attention. There was no time for complete explanations. I passed my small bag to her through the window and then squeezed through the narrow opening. At 23, After 10 pregnancies, my body was no longer that of a thin teenager. But desperation gave me strength I didn't know I had. We walked quickly through the night, avoiding the main streets. Jeanette had a nephew who was waiting for us in an old car at the town exit. The plan had changed, she explained as we walked. We would no longer go to Sacramento. It was too risky. We would go to Los Angeles, where she had a cousin who could shelter us temporarily. And the journalist. The evidence? I asked, worried that all the preparation had been in vain. I sent everything to him yesterday, she replied. Copies of everything you gathered. He'll publish the story in 2 days when we're far from here. I felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Part of me wanted to be present when my grandfather was confronted with his crimes, wanted to see his face when he realized that the granddaughter he thought he had broken had destroyed his life. But another part, the wiser part, more concerned with survival, knew that Jeanette was right. My presence would only complicate things, and I had suffered too much to risk my newly conquered freedom. Jeanette's nephew took us to the bus station of a neighboring town where we caught a bus to Los Angeles. During the nearly 15-hour journey, I barely spoke. I looked out the window, watching the landscape change, the California mountains gradually giving way to the landscapes of Southern California, feeling a confused mixture of emotions. Fear, of course. Fear of being found, of being taken back, but also hope. A fragile, hesitant hope like a plant beginning to sprout in long, barren soil. And surprisingly, guilt. Guilt for leaving behind 10 children. I would never know. 10 pieces of my heart scattered among families who bought the right to be their parents. They're better where they are, Jeanette said at one point as if reading my thoughts. Families with money, education. What could you offer them now? It was true. As painful as it was to admit, I was a 23-year-old young woman without formal education, without professional skills, without money, fleeing from a terrible past. What kind of life could I give to 10 children? But I made a silent promise on that bus as the lights of the road cut through the darkness. One day when I was safe, when I had built something for myself, I would try to find them. Not to disturb their lives or extract truths that might be too painful, but just to know they were well, to be sure that at least something good had come out of so much suffering. We arrived in Los Angeles the next morning. The city was a shock to me, who had never left rural California. The noise, the crowds, the tall buildings, everything seemed unreal, like a movie. Jeanette's cousin, Mrs. Zoe, lived in a small apartment in East Los Angeles. She received us with cautious hospitality, clearly not enthusiastic about harboring fugitives, but the respect she had for Jeanette spoke louder. It was there, 3 days after our escape, that I saw the headline in the newspaper, Mrs. Zoe brought from work. Scandal in Bakersfield baby selling scheme involves important figures. I read the article with trembling hands. The journalist had done an impressive job connecting dots, interviewing people who had suspected the scheme for years, but were afraid to speak, presenting the evidence I had gathered. My name didn't appear. I was identified only as a young woman kept in captivity for more than 10 years. But my story was there, exposed in all its brutality. My grandfather had been arrested along with 2 involved doctors and a sheriff who covered up the scheme. Other clients were being investigated. The article mentioned that I had escaped and that my whereabouts were unknown. It also mentioned my mother. She denied any knowledge of the scheme, claiming that she believed I had mental problems and got pregnant from occasional boyfriends. No one believed her. Of course, the evidence was overwhelming. I felt a complex mixture of emotions when I finished reading. Relief, mainly, justice, finally, but also a deep sadness. Not for my grandfather's downfall. That monster deserved every second in prison, but for the life that was stolen from me, for the years that would never come back, for the lost innocence that no newspaper headline could restore. And now I asked Jeanette that night as we sat on the small balcony of the apartment, looking at the lights of the big city that was now our refuge. "Now you live, girl," she replied, her old eyes shining with a wisdom that only age brings. Live for real for the first time. And that's what I tried to do. With the money I had brought, I rented a simple room in East Los Angeles. I got a job at a local bakery where I learned to make breads and sweets. Slowly, very slowly, I began to rebuild something like a life. But the shadow of the past is long. I had constant nightmares. I startled at sudden noises. I avoided men at all costs. I closed myself in my small world, afraid to trust, to open up, to really live. That's when, 6 months after my escape, an unexpected event changed the course of my life again. A casual encounter that would teach me that even after hell, it's possible to find peace. Even after the most complete darkness, light can shine again. Los Angeles in the 80s was a city of contrasts that both scared and fascinated me. For someone raised in a captivity disguised as home, every corner represented a new challenge. Every social interaction was a test for my wounded spirit. The bakery where I worked was on a busy side street in East LA. I woke up at 4 in the morning to prepare the bread that would feed hundreds of hurried Angelinos. I liked the manual work, the simplicity of transforming flour and water into sustenance, the heat of the oven that somehow seemed to also warm my frozen heart. It was on a rainy March morning in 1980, 6 months after my escape, that I met Sebastian. He walked into the bakery soaking wet, shaking his broken umbrella and laughing at his own bad luck. "Perfect day for a hot coffee and some toast, don't you think?" he asked, smiling at me with a naturalness that disconcerted me. I wasn't used to men who talked to me as if I were a normal person, not an object. Sebastian was a bus driver, 30 years old, with his own story of overcoming adversity. Son of immigrant parents from Honduras, he lost his parents early and was raised by an aunt in difficult conditions. He earned every piece of his life through hard work and a kindness that seemed to resist all the difficulties the world imposed on him. He started appearing at the bakery every morning, always polite, always respectful. He talked about simple things, the weather, news from the paper, a movie that had been on TV. Never personal questions, never invasions of my space, as if he instinctively perceived that I carried deep wounds that shouldn't be touched. I avoided him, of course. I avoided all men, but there was something about Sebastian. Perhaps the way he spoke with the same gentleness to everyone, from the bakery owner to the lady who swept the sidewalk, that slowly began to break through the wall I had built around my heart. Our first date was as simple as it was unexpected. He offered me a ride on a day when the sky opened up over Los Angeles. I accepted only because the alternative was waiting hours for a bus that might not even come. In the old but impeccably clean car, we really talked for the first time. He told me about his dream of having a small ranch on the outskirts of the city, raising chickens, planting a garden. He spoke of the future with a hope that was completely foreign to me. "And you, Teresa? What's your dream?" he asked with genuine interest. I remained silent for so long that he must have thought I wouldn't answer. The truth is that I had never allowed myself to dream. Surviving already consumed all my energy. "Peace," I finally replied. "I just want a little peace." He nodded, as if that simple answer contained all the wisdom in the world. He didn't ask any more questions. He just turned on the radio, letting the music fill the silence between us. Our relationship grew with the slowness of a delicate plant. First the occasional rides, then walks around the neighborhood on Sundays, a movie now and then, always respecting my limits, never pressing for more than I could give. It took me 6 months to tell him fragments of my story. Not everything. I didn't have the courage for that, but enough for him to understand why I trembled when someone raised their voice. Why I recoiled when a man came too close. Why I cried when I saw children playing in parks. Sebastian listened to everything without interrupting, without judging. When I finished, he simply held my hand. The first physical contact we allowed beyond a quick goodbye hug, and said, "You're the strongest person I've ever met, Teresa." I didn't feel strong. I felt broken, damaged, incomplete. But something in the way he looked at me as if he saw beyond the scars made me think that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild myself. Our first kiss happened almost a year after we met on a park bench in front of the East LA church. It was hesitant, gentle, and made me cry. Not from pain or fear, but because I realized that despite everything, I was still capable of feeling something beyond trauma. There was still room in me for tenderness. "We can go as slowly as you need." He told me that night. I have all the time in the world. And that's exactly what we did. We dated for 3 years before getting married in a simple ceremony at the same church where we shared our first kiss. I was 27 years old and felt like I was being born again. Sebastian knew my whole story by then. Every dark detail, every horror I had lived through. He knew the scars on my body and on my soul. And yet somehow, miraculously, he loved me. Our married life was a constant learning experience. There were nights when I woke up screaming, trapped in nightmares where my grandfather came back to take me. Moments when intimacy became impossible. When the gentlest touch triggered terrible memories. Sebastian never complained, never demanded. He just held me in silence, waiting for the storm inside me to pass. Slowly, I found my way back to life. With the help of a psychologist recommended by Jeanette, who remained a constant and loving presence in our life, I began to process the trauma to understand that what happened to me didn't completely define me, didn't determine my future. In 1984, 2 years after our marriage, Sebastian managed to realize his dream. With our combined savings, we bought a small ranch in Riverside County in the rural area outside Los Angeles. Nothing luxurious, a simple house, a piece of land, some fruit trees already planted, but it was ours. A safe place far from the shadows of the past. It was in that same year that we faced our first major challenge as a couple. After months of trying to get pregnant without success, doctors confirmed what we already suspected. The complications from my 10th birth had left permanent school. I could never have biological children again. For many women, this news would be devastating. For me, it was complex. On one hand, there was the sadness of not being able to give Sebastian a child of our love. On the other, a guilty relief at not having to go through the physical and emotional process of pregnancy again, so associated in my mind with trauma and loss. "We can adopt," Sebastian said on the night we received the medical confirmation. "There are so many children needing a home, love. We can build our family in other ways." The idea of adoption touched something deep in me. My 10 biological children were scattered around the world, living lives I would never know. Perhaps this was a way to heal that wound, not by replacing them, as that would be impossible, but by channeling the maternal love I never got to express to children who, like me, had been marked by abandonment and pain. The adoption process in the 80s was bureaucratic and slow, especially for a simple origin couple like us. But Sebastian was persistent, and I had learned that patience can be a form of resistance. We visited orphanages, filled out forms, went through interviews and evaluations. It was at a shelter in Pasadena that we found Marina, a 4-year-old girl with eyes too serious for her age. She had been abandoned by her teenage mother and had gone through 2 adoptive families who returned her for being too difficult. She didn't talk much, had constant nightmares, and sometimes had seemingly unprovoked anger crises. I immediately recognized in her the reflection of my own pain. When we approached her little bed in the collective dormitory, she curled up like a wounded little animal, expecting yet another rejection. Instead, I sat on the floor at a distance and began to sing softly a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me before everything fell apart. On the third day of our visit, she allowed me to brush her hair. On the fifth, she held Sebastian's hand as we walked through the shelter's garden. On the 10th, she timidly asked if she could call us Mum and Dad. It took almost a year for all the legal procedures to be completed. In 1986, we finally took Marina home. Our family had officially begun. The first months were difficult. Marina constantly tested our limits, as if expecting that at any moment we would give up on her like everyone before us. She had crying crises that lasted for hours, refused to sleep alone, destroyed toys in fits of fury. But I understood that pain, understood the fear of abandonment, the anger against a world that seemed determined to hurt the most vulnerable. And gradually, with consistent love and safe boundaries, Marina began to flourish. Her first genuine laugh upon seeing a newborn kid goat on our small farm was like music to my ears. 2 years later, we expanded our family again. This time it was 2 siblings, Carlos, 6 years old, and Anna, only 2. They had lost their parents in a car accident and had no other relatives willing to raise them. Carlos was protective and serious, taking on responsibilities far beyond his age. Anna, so small, was still looking for her mother in the first weeks. Our house, once so quiet, filled with children's voices, with running around with daily small discoveries. We planted together in the garden, took care of the animals, watched TV, cuddled up on rainy nights. Sebastian built swings in the trees and taught Carlos to fish in the stream that crossed our property. I made cakes on Sundays and told stories before bedtime, invented stories where sad children found families who loved them forever. In 1990, our family was completed with the arrival of Wim, a baby of only 3 months who had been abandoned at the door of a church. Unlike the other children, he didn't carry traumatic memories, only the universal need to be loved. Marina, now 10 years old, took on the role of older sister with pride, helping care for the baby as if it were her own mission in life. Looking at my 4 children, because that's how I saw them, as my heart's children. I sometimes wondered about the other 10, those I carried in my womb. Were they well? Were they happy? Did they know anything about their origins? The answer to the last question came unexpectedly in 1992, when Wim was only 2 years old. A letter arrived addressed to me with no return address. Inside, a newspaper clipping and a handwritten note. The clipping was from a California newspaper dated that same year. It talked about a recently published book that revealed details of the Bakersfield surrogate wombs case, as my grandfather's scheme had become known. The book's author was identified only as son of one of the involved couples who had discovered his origins after finding documents hidden in his parents' house. The handwritten note simply said, "Thank you for giving us life even in the worst circumstances. Some of us now know the truth. We are well. I hope you are too." I cried for hours after reading those words. I cried for the girl I was, for the mother I never could be, for those 10 children, for the lives that followed paths so different from mine. But for the first time, they weren't just tears of pain. There was also relief, gratitude, a sense that something important had been recognized and honored. I never discovered which of my biological children had found me or how. I respected their desire for anonymity, their choice to just let me know they were well, that they knew part of the truth. It was more than I ever expected to have. The following years were of relative tranquility. Our children grew up, faced their own challenges, built their identities. Marina became a teacher. her serious manner finding purpose in educating other children. Carlos followed Sebastian's footsteps, becoming a professional driver. Anna discovered a talent for music that we cultivated with pride. And Wim, our youngest, grew up as a happy and confident child without the shadows that marked his older siblings. Sebastian and I grew old together, our love maturing like a good wine. He was diagnosed with diabetes in 1995, which brought some limitations to our life. But we faced this as we faced everything together, one day at a time. In 2010, we received the news that my grandfather had died in prison. He was 92 years old and, according to the newspaper, never showed repentance for his crimes. My mother had died years earlier in 1998, alone in her beach house without ever having tried to contact me. I felt nothing beyond a vague sense of closure when I learned of these deaths. Those people who shared my blood, but never my values, had ceased to have power over me long ago. My true family was around me, in the husband who taught me to trust again, in the children we chose and who chose us, in the grandchildren who were beginning to arrive, bringing new life and hope. Today, at 68 years old, I look back and see a life that, despite its traumatic beginning, was filled with much more love than pain. Sebastian, my companion of 43 years, remains by my side, a little slower due to age, but with the same gentle smile that won me over in that bakery in East LA. Our home is the meeting point for Sunday lunches where 3 generations gather. Marina, Carlos, Anna, and Wim bring their own children, my precious grandchildren, and we fill the table with food, stories, laughter. In the happiest moments, I look around and think, this is healing. This is redemption. I never returned to Bakersfield. I never wanted to see the places that were the setting for my suffering. But I also never hid my story from my children when they grew up. I told them age-appropriate versions, always emphasizing that the horrors I experienced didn't define who I became. Life can break you, I always tell them. But it's up to you to decide whether you'll remain broken or whether you'll gather the pieces and build something new. That's what I did. I gathered my pieces one by one with patience and determination. I built a life that, although marked by visible and invisible scars, is mine. A life I chose, not one that was imposed on me. If you're watching this video and going through difficult times, know that there is hope on the other side of pain. That even in the darkest situations, there's always the possibility of light. That you are stronger than you imagine and more resilient than you believe. My dear ones who have followed my story to this point, I ask you to leave your like on this video and subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel. It's very important for me to know that my account touched hearts and perhaps helped someone who is going through difficulties similar to those I faced. Life isn't always fair, my dears. Sometimes it hits us with such force that it seems impossible to get up. But believe the word of this old woman who has seen it all. Dawn always comes after the darkest night, and when it arrives, it brings with it the chance for a new beginning. A loving embrace from this grandma who learned in the hardest way that our greatest strength usually reveals itself precisely in the moments when we think we have no strength at all. Until the next,